Glasgow, in truth, is a very Tokyo for tea rooms. Nowhere can one have so much for so little, nowhere are such places more popular and frequented. So wrote J.H. Muir, who was in fact 3 bright young men hiding beneath a pseudonym, in Glasgow in 1901, a little book introducing the city to the torrent of visitors coming to its second great international exhibition. They identified what was by then a distinct phenomenon produced by the entrepreneurial openness to opportunity that distinguished Glasgow at its height. The tea rooms became embedded into city life in a very particular way. Glaswegians loved them for their cheapness, their high standards, and their convenience. And this thriving, unstuffy business city was the same Glasgow that produced a distinctive local flowering of art and design in the later 19th century. And Miss Cranston's flair was to combine all this into something truly special. So the beginnings were shaped by the Cranstons, brother and sister. It's the redoubtable Kate, who's become well known again, eagerly taken up, of course, as a woman who can be written back into history, and appreciated for her crucially important role in the career of Glasgow's now acknowledged architectural genius, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. She was, in many ways, inimitable, but she was imitated, and by countless others. In Glasgow and beyond, tea rooms multiplied in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, and then in the Edwardian years, slightly more slowly, and went on developing long after Miss Cranston withdrew from business, dominated in the 1920s and 30s by the super tea rooms of Glasgow's great family baking firms. They were only really finished off after the Second World War, along with so much of Glasgow's economy.
Hello and welcome to Scran, the podcast passionate about the Scottish food and drink scene. I'm your host, Rosalind, and you just heard from Peter Gilchrist, author of Taking Tea with Mackintosh, the story of Miss Cranston's tea rooms, talking about Kate Cranston, the First Lady of Glasgow's tea rooms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was taken from the 2025 Scottish Food History Symposium on tea, which took place recently and was delivered in partnership with Mackintosh at the Willow and the National Trust for Scotland. On this episode of Scran, we're exploring Scotland's relationship with tea, and specifically the rise of the tea rooms in Glasgow. I am joined by Dr Lindsey Middleton, food historian and knowledge exchange associate at the University of Glasgow, and friend of the podcast Peter Gilchrist, who's a Scottish food history writer. Lindsey and Peter organised and hosted the tea symposium, which I went along to at Mackintosh at the Willow in Glasgow. There I learnt how tea in Glasgow was linked to women, trade and slavery, art, class, tourism, Scottish identity and the diaspora. The event was truly fascinating and shared the rich history of Glaswegian tea rooms. You'll hear snippets from some of the sessions that were run at the event, including Professor Andrew McKillop's talk on some of the earliest presence of tea in Glasgow and how it became surprisingly political.
You all know yourselves that food is hugely political. Drink is hugely political. The questions of whether it's good for a society or bad for a society, we're going to hear about sugar in any number of different ways. What's the morality behind its production? What's the morality behind its consumption?
You'll also hear more from Peter Gilchrist. She shared some wonderful insight into the visionary entrepreneur and patron of modern design and architecture, Kate Cranston. Peter, Lindsey, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Peter, welcome back. I think you're the guest we've had on the most.
Am I?
Yeah,
right.
Congratulations.
A moniker I wear with pride.
So we're just finished up your tea symposium, which is at the Mackintosh at the Willow in Glasgow this afternoon. We've been here all afternoon, but it's been going on since this morning. Absolutely fascinating. Can you just tell us a little bit about how this all came about and why?
So this is our second annual Scottish Food Heritage Symposium. This year's subject has been tea because we partnered with Mackintosh at the Willow, and these came out of a network of food researchers and partners that I help run at the University of Glasgow's College of Arts and Humanities, called our Food Catalyst. And that the sort of original aim of that was to bring people together working in the space, try and work out our shared challenges and how we might form new collaborations and projects to solve them. So we wanted to do more around events that would help us celebrate and platform Scottish food heritage. And the last event that we ran together, Peter and I, went really, really well. And this year we thought we'd partner with Mackintosh at the Willow, just given how integral a subject tea is to our day-to-day lives. And the fact that we have this really interesting history in Glasgow in this beautiful building. So that's how the kind of tea topic came around, and we've spent the day exploring tea rooms, tea history, the history of sugar. It's been a really interesting overall event. I've learned so much.
One of the catalysts when we were breaking up into tables and trying to have a discussion about what is missing from like the Scottish food scene, and we were talking about we need more opportunities for us to talk to people and to meet as collectives in a very selfish way. We want more jobs and we want to find other people that are as passionate about Scottish food as ourselves. And Lindsey helped to kind of pull people together. We found funding last year, it went really well. We found funding this year from Scotland Food and Drinks Regional Food Fund, and that has allowed us to kind of form this partnership this year with Mackintosh at the Willow. And again, I think what we're talking about here is a breadth of Scottish food history. We've got everything from like Japanese tea ceremonies to the Scottish Women's Rural Institute and cookery book history. There's so much in there, and it's kind of, this can only happen when you get a day like this where people can come in and talk about what they're passionate about.
Obviously, Scottish food history is incredibly broad, and we would like to just continue exploring various
just keep
aspects.
plugging away.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's so much more than the sort of stereotypical. I mean, we were saying before we set up in here that it's interesting to see Glasgow through the lens of the tea room. Like, it was good quality food, it was quite cheap. There was none of the stereotypical stuff we see now. Here's Professor Andrew McKillop taking us back a few hundred years to the early days of Scotland's love affair with tea.
By the 1740s, 50s, the English East India Company can tell Scotland is not drinking tea in anything like the amount you would expect, except it is. It's just not drinking their tea. What it's doing is it's bringing it in across the North Sea, and we get an idea, a brilliant moment in time, where the British state begins to recognise the scale of the problem. In 1785, Henry Dundas, the political manager of Scotland at the time, sends actually a guy from what is now Garscube Estate, the Lord Advocate, Isla Campbell of Succoth family. He says, we need to find out why we're getting no tax returns from tea in Scotland. We know everybody's consuming it. Why is there no tax returns? The result is, interestingly, he sends Campbell off on a QT mission to visit the Hellfire Clubs. I'm afraid that's a gentle word for the sex clubs of Leith and Glasgow, to speak to the major smugglers, to find out what it is that's going on. Their argument is it's too heavily taxed. It's an insult to Scotland to have to take tea from an English London-based monopoly, so they throw in a bit of Scottish patriotism just for boots. And most importantly, they say it's just terrible tea. Swedish tea is brilliant, and that's what Scots are used to. The scale of that smuggling is such that Campbell finds out that large swathes of northern England are drinking Swedish tea imported by Scots. Most of north of Ireland is drinking Swedish tea. In other words, there's a wave of Congo tea that's supplied by Scotland, and almost no East India Company tea is being drunk. To give you an idea of how much it is, Campbell is able to discover that in Glasgow alone in 1785, something like over 330 pounds of tea a day is being drunk. In other words, 49 tonnes of tea per year in what's still a relatively small town. In other words, tea comes in, but it's not that later version of a British Empire or an imperial British one. It comes in through Northern Europe, because Scotland, of course, is part of Northern European society. So, that, however, does not mean that doesn't produce, as you'd expect, cultural reaction and interaction. You all know yourselves that food is hugely political. Drink is hugely political. The questions of whether it's good for a society or bad for a society, we're going to hear about sugar in any number of different ways. What's the morality behind its production? What's the morality behind its consumption? And Scots are drinking tea in huge amounts, but there is a ferocious counter-reaction to it. I'm going to use the example from the Scots magazine from 1744 of the good tenantry of Brisbane, who basically write in terms that they're basically going, this is a morally corrupt, foreign commodity which we are not going to touch. Note the gender dimension, right? Tea is seen as feminine and effeminizing, and good, strong, hardy Scottish farmers aren't going to touch it with a barge pole, right? Now, what's really interesting is every single borough in Scotland, including Glasgow, sign up to that resolution. You're not going to believe what the response to, or their suggestion of how you deal with this. He said, we've got to encourage everybody to drink much more alcohol. We've got to make sure that they're drinking strong beer, because that uses up crops and barley. And above all, they go, I can't believe this, they go, we've really got to encourage them to start doing home distilling for hard spirits. So by the 1740s, the answer is less tea, more alcohol. Brilliant, right? Now, when you think about it, one of the major forms of Glasgow borough income is the 1 penny tax on each pint of beer drunk. So tea is attacking Glasgow's fiscal base. Glasgow is one of the boroughs that comes storming out, wanting the tax on tea. But over the 18th century, people are beginning to take a different view of it. So when you look at someone like Godfrey MacCallum, he's a surgeon from Greenock, writes a very important treatise on the sort of properties of tea. He's basically beginning to get people to go, no, tea's good, keeps people sober, keeps them sort of compos mentis. And he goes, and he makes an interesting point. He says, the kind of tea that's drunk in Scotland is this strong, dark Congo type teas from Sweden, and it fits the constitution of the Scots. They like this sort of stronger, heavier tea because, as he says, they've got kind of water that they think can handle it. And look what he says about Scots. Basically, they'll treat their own bodies in a sort of harder way. They've got sort of, they're not so much worried about their organs as they're said, you know. So they're basically coming up with stereotypes that Scots will drink a certain type of dark tea, while the rather more sort of sophisticated, subtle English will drink a sort of lighter tea down south. In other words, you're getting a sort of modification of the idea that actually Scottish society is comfortable with tea and it does have beneficial effects. And that's kind of really coming into force increasingly from the mid to later 18th century.
So we've heard a few sessions this afternoon about Glasgow's complicated relationship with tea. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a number of our sessions today have sort of delved into when tea began to be imported into Scotland and into Glasgow. And obviously Glasgow was the second city of empire, so it was a very key player in the sort of trade of things like tea and sugar. One of the things that was touched upon was Glasgow in particular being a kind of powerhouse when it came to trading things like tea and sugar because of our boat building culture. So we were building ships, the tea clippers. We were kind of at the forefront of that as an innovation, as a transport system that allowed tea to be brought into Scotland at a sort of large volume. We also heard about tea smuggling, about how tea was contentious because after the union with England in 1707, we lost the ability to trade tea legally. There was a monopoly enforced by the British East India Company. They were wanted to operate solely out of London, and Scottish merchants weren't overly happy with that because it was a massive economic thing to be losing out on. So we instead began trading with the Swedish East India Company, and that basically started a whole illicit tea culture in Scotland where it was smuggled into the country all over different ports from tiny towns right up to the big cities. That was quite a contentious thing because it was a missed tax opportunity for people who wanted to collect tax, but also Scottish people wanted to drink tea, import tea, as a kind of political statement against England having the monopoly on trade. So there are all sorts of layers in which this is political. The talks are really interesting at showing how that changes over time. Like tea can symbolise different political moments depending on where you're looking. Very similar with sugar and slavery and abolition and how that gets kind of battened about as a kind of a part of politics. It's not just about the product itself, it's about everything that it symbolises and the powers that are kind of batting it back and forth to suit their own agendas. So it's been really interesting to see how that history was very contested at different points.
Here's Professor Andrew McKillop again talking about the politics of tea in some more detail. Apologies for some noise coming from a very busy Sucky Hall Street in the background.
Tea, because of the nature of it's a natural product, you need to move it quickly if you want it to have the efficacious effects you want it to do. It's got all that idea of becoming associated with speed, of movement, of, in a sense, something which exemplifies the new interconnected world, because you need to get the first crop over as quick as you can. So the result is you get, the high prestige ships that run this commodity, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. Glasgow, and in fact Scotland, next to the eastern seaboard of the United States, absolutely leads the world in the construction of those ships. American clippers and Scottish clippers are the fastest, and in a sense the two poster boy girls of the clipper era, of course, is the Cutty Sark and the Thermopylae. They're both Scottish built ships, one in Aberdeen and the Cutty Sark, of course not in Glasgow but in part of the emerging Clyde based systems of. That's a hugely prestigious floating statement of Glasgow and its shipbuilding sitting at the very cutting edge, quite literally, of one of the world's great global commodities. Tea was political in the 17th and 18th century, and it remains a lethally political product, right? And still, it's one of the ways, it's a lodestone for Scotland's unhappiness at the monopoly of the English East India Company, a London-based organisation which, under the terms of the Union, insisted upon the liquidation of Scotland's company, and in return, Scotland did not get access to Asia. One of the big myths of the 1707 Union is that Scotland gets access to Britain's empire. It doesn't, it gets access to half the empire. The English East India Company keeps control of one whole half of world trade, and Scottish society hates that because it sees it as a denial of its Britishness. So what we start to see happen in 1713, 12 and 13, and then again in 1829 through to 33, is the formation of very powerful Glasgow-based East India associations, which are lobbying for the destruction of the company's monopoly. And the two most effective and powerful cities that do these are Liverpool and Glasgow. Leeds and lots of other cities are involved, but the two big guns that go for the company's monopoly, first of all in the India trade, are Glasgow and Liverpool. Now, when you look at the membership of the Glasgow East India Company Association, it is noticeable. It is all the West Indian merchants, right? So sugar is also crucial to the way Glasgow is lobbying for greater access to tea. That's why there's a huge connection between sugar and tea. It's sugar and cotton interests which are bringing Glasgow's political weight to bear against the East India Company in alliance with Liverpool. They do the same again in 1829, not just to get access to the India trades, but to finally smash open free trade to China. And the result is, from 34 through 35, Edinburgh actually, as John was saying, gets in there first, but Glasgow's sending out ships rapidly thereafter. All of that means that in the end, what you have is a story of a sort of massive tea culture that's there unofficially for a long time before we get the official type story we understand. But it's also lethally political. We think of tea as cosy, warming and nice. It's just as political as a Tesla or anything else is today, right? It could be that you're cocking a snoot at the British state, as Campbell was as a Jacobite, and a rejection of the East India Company's authority. Or even in the 1820s, to get rid of its monopoly of access to China. And Glasgow, as a big provincial port, is at the heart of that political story. Thank you very much.
At what point did it sort of go from the merchants and sort of trading to like people's jobs and like kind of what we saw more modernly, which is the advent of the tea room?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the 19th century, so we're talking about the 1800s here, we see tea merchants setting up in Glasgow. And at a tea shop, you can go in and you can request a sample. And then sometimes you might also be able to have a cake. And that was Stuart Cranston. He was Kate Cranston's brother. He had a tea shop. You could go in and try some tea, have a wee slice of something. His sister, Kate Cranston, saw the potential and thought, I'm going to set up a tea room where we will serve tea. People can come in and they can socialise. At that time, it was very difficult for women to meet together outside of the home. It was improper for women to be without their husbands or without a male escort. So what we see is this kind of revolutionary idea that starts in the middle of the Victorian era, in the middle of the 1800s, and it catches fire in Glasgow, and then suddenly other cities begin to follow. Glasgow begins to have this entire tea room culture that's employing both merchants, waitresses, women are getting jobs, people can leave the home. It changes the landscape of society, and not in a small way, because very soon after Glasgow develops its tea room culture, Manchester, London, Liverpool, big cities begin to realise the value in tea rooms and invests in them. Entrepreneurs copy the model that was developed right here in Glasgow.
Here's Perilla Kinchin again.
Whatever the entrepreneurial flair of the Cranstons, their businesses would not have taken root and been so quickly imitated if they did not perfectly meet the felt needs of the time. And these were essentially the separate needs of men and of women in a society strongly influenced by the temperance movement. Temperance coffee rooms and refreshment rooms were clear forerunners of the tea rooms in respectability. Both Cranstons were practical abstainers, but temperance was never an issue in the presentation of the tea rooms, which traded simply on the excellence of their offer. And thanks to the tasteful feminine quality developed by Miss Cranston and her followers, they shook off that suspicion of dourness which attached to the more evangelical temperance establishments. The primary demand identified by Miss Cranston, as we've seen, was from men. The businessman's morning break for coffee and smoke and gossip was held to be an important tool of wealth creation. With their men-only smoking rooms, the tea rooms met this need. And then, with Glasgow growing ever westwards, men couldn't get home for lunch, as in the old days. There was an honour system of payment. That is, you ate ad lib, did some mental arithmetic, and paid. And this was something universally adopted by the tea rooms. You notice that they also stood and kept their hats on to support the impression they weren't really stopping for lunch. Other places for midday refreshment, chop houses, taverns, pie shops, restaurants, but they served alcohol. Men, under pressure from their womenfolk to moderate their drinking, or young clerks just counting their pennies, gladly sat down in a tea room for a cheap and well-cooked lunch. The needs of women were the crucial new element of demand, as Cranston saw, advertising to them as customers for his loose tea. After being housebound in earlier Victorian days, they were eager to get out and about more, and shopping became a key leisure activity with the growth from the 1880s of the new department stores. Tea rooms, most offering restrooms, were useful ports of call, especially for lunch and afternoon tea. Importantly, they were respectably accessible without a male escort, because even the smallest premises tried to provide the safe space of a dedicated ladies' room. So the 1890s, the decade of the new, saw a great leap forward in the city in many respects, and tea rooms multiplied. In 1895, the Evening News wrote, "A decade ago, the tea rooms of the city could be counted on one's fingers. Now their name is Legion." Like other papers, they were picking up on a noticeable social phenomenon of the time. Vegetarianism and women's bicycling also made frequent copy.
We're in Mackintosh at the Willow now. If we were to walk in here in its heyday, what would we have been met with?
I think the thing particularly about Kate Cranston's tea rooms, and she had multiple around Glasgow, as we heard earlier, was the fact that she had very high quality in mind all the time. So not just in terms of food, but also in terms of the decor. And she initially worked with a different artist before she started working with Mackintosh. But what I found was really interesting was the fact that she frequently took chances on like the kind of new or lesser known artists. She seemed to be quite a risk taker in terms of, one, the kind of very specific styles in which she decorated her tea room, and two, the fact that she was happy to like basically hand over control to these designers, artists that hadn't really cut their teeth yet. There was different kind of spaces within the tea rooms. There would have been billiard rooms that were for men with billiard tables, and then there would have typically been a salon or a lounge for women only, and then there were also spaces that were mixed. So one of the things that's really interesting about the tea rooms in Glasgow is that you could have paid more if you were here at the Willow, for instance, to sit in the Salon Deluxe, which was a very sort of beautiful room, kind of height of luxury within the tea room. But they were also spaces for everyone. You paid on a kind of honour system where you judged what you'd eaten and then you paid. So you could come if you didn't have a huge amount of money. You wouldn't have been served in any different way. The waitresses also were always beautifully dressed. You know, it was part of a whole experience, no matter who you were. And I think that's really interesting. And I really loved hearing today about how Kate establishes that relationship with Mackintosh as a very young new artist, and she was probably arguably his foremost patron, and she gave him artistic free rein on multiple properties, and also like the menus. His fiancée and wife was also involved in the art, and she kind of gives this designer a platform which is probably integral to him then becoming like world renowned, because now people probably associate the Willow far more with Mackintosh than they do with Kate. Similarly with Glasgow, people know Charles Rennie Mackintosh's designs. We saw today there was loads of like knockoffs, both in terms of tea rooms and also tea rooms in that particular style. So it became a kind of cultural movement of its own. And that was a really interesting thing for me to see, how this woman just kind of making a decision to take a chance on this artist basically created one of Glasgow's and Scotland's icons. And, the rise of tea rooms in Glasgow was inextricable from the temperance movement that was trying to move people away from drinking alcohol and towards other things. And a huge part of that was the fact that a lot of the social spaces in the city were pubs, or, places that you could go and you could have a drink with your lunch, or, it was part of the socializing that we were all used to. So tea rooms offered an alternative. And Kate, she was, part of the temperance movement. She abstained from alcohol. That wasn't like you come into the tea room because you're abstaining. That wasn't the selling point. The selling point was you can come and have a beautiful experience somewhere, have a social experience, and booze just isn't involved. So she managed to hit the kind of right time of the temperance movement taking hold across Scotland, but also sold it in a way that it wasn't too on the nose. You wouldn't have felt like you were coming to a tea room because you were trying to abstain from drinking a pint. It was actually like, I'm going to the tea room to have a lovely experience. And because it was tied in to this wider cultural movement to try and stop people from drinking as much, there was more incentive for people to go.
Four floors, with the kitchen in the basement, housing a suite of lunch and tea rooms, including a billiard room for the men. The revealed building was in fashionable historicist style. It was inside that there was something dazzlingly new. Miss Cranston had handed all the decor and furnishing, right down to the cutlery, to George Walton, except for some wall decoration on 3 floors, for which she tried out the new art weirdry, to use a journalist phrase, of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And this establishment, which became her HQ, shot Miss Cranston's tea rooms to sight of the city status when they opened in 1897. The English architect Edwin Lutyens captured this perfectly, writing home to his fiancée that he was taken along to a Miss Somebody's who is really a Mrs. Somebody else. It's all very elaborately simple on very new school high art lines. The result is gorgeous and a wee bit vulgar. She has nothing but green-handled knives, and all is curiously painted and coloured. Visiting again the next year, he went straight from the station to these queer, funny rooms and recorded his most excellent breakfast: tea, butter, jam, toasts, baps and buns, 2 sausages, 2 eggs, speak it not in Gath, all for 1 and a penny. So clean most beautiful peonies on the breakfast table, and the china the same as ours. He then describes her as a dark, busy, fat wee body with black, sparky, humorous eyes, and ends, "So I am much amused and greatly entertained. The food, etc., at 1/3 the cost and 3 times better than the ordinary hotel, and the surroundings full of space for fancy and amusement." So Lutyens puts his finger on the elements of Miss Cranston's success. Beyond the engaging avant-garde decor, which was covered in The Studio, Britain's leading art magazine, her offer was built on reliable quality and good value for money. From this point on, all Miss Cranston's major work came to Mackintosh, and she was simply his best and most loyal patron over the next years, through thick and thin. She evidently responded to Mackintosh's perfectionism, and they developed a relationship of trust. She gave him a pretty free hand, enormously important for his development, and seemed not to quibble at overrunning costs. Total control suited him. The tea room, unlike a domestic interior, would be kept just as he conceived it. He gave her that something extra, that over-the-top quality which made the tea room experience something exciting and special. By the mid-1950s, countless social and economic changes had undermined the viability of the old tea rooms. Overheads above all, the lifting of the taboo on alcohol, the lapse of men's coffee out of the office habit, middle-class women now labouring as housewives. There was a general admiration for the new and disregard of the old. Coffee became more popular than tea. Tablecloths gave way to formica. The local bakeries were hoovered up by conglomerates. Foreign exoticism was the preferred style for eating places. The Greek Cypriot Rostakis came to town. He bought up some tea rooms and turned them into steakhouses, all licensed, and decorated in contemporary style, which was, of course, external to Glasgow. Like Miss Cranston, he succeeded by giving people what they wanted. He, too, could claim to have revolutionised Scottish catering. At the closing of Cranston's premises in Queen Street in 1954, there was a slight awareness of their significance. We've often heard the claim made that this was the original tea room from which all other tea rooms in the country have derived. Certainly it was always a pleasant reminder that this was one of Great Britain's many institutions which have had their beginnings in Victorian Glasgow, wrote the Journal of the Chamber of Commerce. Cranston's went into liquidation in 1955. Miss Cranston's Ingram Street premises were bought by the corporation under pressure in 1950, but not looked after. In 1971, the building was ironically enough sold to Stakis, but not before, thankfully, a few knowledgeable people were able to dismantle and store the battered remains of the interiors. But in the mid-1970s came the first signs of a turning of the tide, a feeling that destruction and loss had gone too far. Mackintosh Society was founded in 1973, here, I believe. In 1974, thank you. Cranston's, as people recalled with warmth Glasgow's heyday and something very special. Thank you.
It's really interesting. We touched on this earlier, how it was really good quality, cheap, a way to get like good quality, cheap breakfast, lunch and high tea. And I mean, this is probably a bit of a daft question because they still exist now, like we're sitting in the Willow. But a lot like the Winston Churchill's kind of diners that they kind of say we should bring them back. Could we and should we see an original idea for the tea room coming back to culture now?
I think we have fantastic tea rooms and coffee houses. Again, the culture has changed over the last 150 years. I definitely think there is a need for perhaps subsidised food where people with dignity can go into a place like a Willow, the tea room, or like a coffee shop and be able to buy high quality, affordable food and socialise. There's such a paywall now on conversation between people and having meaningful meetings. I mean, I know for myself, me and my friends, we're all in our mid-30s, everyone's getting married or having a baby, we struggle to find time to come together, and I think we need to revolutionise meeting in places that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, but actually can allow you to reduce isolation, not cost the earth, and have some really great Scottish food.
Yeah, because no shade to any of the bakeries in Glasgow, they're great, but they are expensive. Yeah. There's really good food and I enjoy them, I love a good coffee, but the £5 coffee's coming.
Yeah, I know. I've been talking this week about this new phase of the £6 croissant that everyone's chatting about. And like, there is a place for that because the commodities which go into baking are expensive. Butter, eggs, milk, these things are really expensive at the moment. Paying people a living wage is incredibly important, but also very expensive. And so eating out has become something for the elites. It's become something for people that have disposable income. So, and a wider conversation about what we do with Scottish food and repairing our food systems, having some kind of offering where people of all incomes of people can eat with dignity in public and come together.
So as with a lot of things, good things come to an end. So can you talk us through how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, poverty is cyclical. And after the war, Glasgow experienced a big downturn. People weren't building ships to send off to war anymore. And so people have less money. You then have mortgages that start to go up. Businesses experience hardship. She began to sell off some of her tea rooms. When you get to the Second World War, rationing has a big impact on what businesses can sell. A tea room that runs on the honour system and is trying to provide high quality food at cheap prices and paying people a living wage and paying towards health insurance and things like that. These are expensive things, and unfortunately our businesses didn't survive long after the war. But again, success is also cyclical, and we are seeing now a resurgence of people celebrating the history of the tea rooms. People care so much about Rennie Mackintosh. I think we are very happy to claim him as Scottish people, and I think I'd like us to do a wee bit more of that with Kate Cranston and her legacy. So no, yeah, I definitely think the story of tea rooms is the story of Glasgow and how Glasgow can bounce back, and that's what I think is so exciting about days like today, where we can really look at it in detail about the story of tea in Scotland.
You both did talks today, didn't you?
I did a talk on the look at the Scottish Women's Rural Institute cookery books and how essentially it's a 100-year anniversary of the first cookery book that was released from the Scottish Women's Rural Institute. Every recipe was submitted was a family recipe from women around Scotland, and over 100 years we can now track what was served on the tables in Scottish households and how it evolved with how women's roles in the home changed. It was a fascinating, I'm not going to say my talk was fascinating, but a fascinating day of talks.
And I think there's also something to be said for the importance of events like this in creating an appetite for that kind of preservation of cultural heritage. After one of the talks earlier today, we were discussing where the things are from Kate Cranston's tea rooms, because she had numerous around the city, all of them done in this beautiful style, and all of the buildings had an individual bespoke works of art that nowadays you would be putting so much money into, and I think she was putting a lot of money into them. And now they're kind of all just disjointed, dotted around. And obviously Mackintosh at the Willow is a beautiful example of good cultural preservation. You can come here, you can see the original doors, the building is in the original facade. There was something quite special about listening to our keynote, Pearla Kinchin, talk about this, and she had an image of the original tea rooms on, and you could see the windows of the room we were sitting in as we were listening. But, there are other parts of that. There's the majority of that art and that kind of history is just sitting either in museum holding collections or probably in lots of personal collections and in lofts and things. Mm-hmm. And I think the more that we can talk about this stuff and show how important it is, the more likely it's going to be protected and preserved for the next generation.
I think the story of tea rooms and the story of Kate Cranston is crying out for like a Netflix series.
Yes.
Like, I want to see The Crown, like that model of like young Kate Cranston setting up her business, Kate Cranston at the end of her life, and showing like she had such an amazing impact of funding our artists. Glasgow would not be what it is today had Kate Cranston not taken the risk in hiring unknown artists and giving people chances. And I think that we need to do more in, number one, us celebrating our great stories, and two, lobbying people to have them recognise our stories.
So obviously this is your second one. What have you guys got on the cards for next time?
I definitely think we want to have another symposium. We're going to try and hopefully find a partner, maybe a venue, maybe sponsors.
Sponsors would be good, just because, I mean, this is amazing and so many people love it, but it is dependent on Peter and I finding the time to put together funding applications, which we can do, but it's like a significant, and it's not a sure thing. You know, it means if the funding stops, the events stop, which obviously we don't want to happen. So just more campaigning, evaluation from days like today is really important to show that there is an appetite for this kind of stuff. We obviously have our own podcast. I don't know if that's okay to plug on yours, but
The competition.
the Scottish Food History podcast. So we're going to continue producing that.
Yeah.
And yeah, just see what's on the cards.
You know, last year we wrote a report called Beyond the Tartan Tin, and it was more for kind of government and agencies and people to try and show that there is a case for investing in Scottish food history. There's an economic case, there's a culture case, there's an education case. Food history is such an untapped resource for us to connect with our own people and to connect with other people that feel Scottish around the world or have Scottish ancestry. So I think for us this year, we're trying to act on those actions, the things that we brought out of that report. And it's things like developing education packs, developing more events, trying to connect more with the private sector in Scotland and shouting about how great our Scottish food history is. It isn't just whiskey. It isn't just haggis. It isn't just the tartan tin of shortbread. Those things are great, but the stories that go along with them, the other food that most people in this country has never heard of, that our grandparents ate every day, that's the real gems, and that's what we're really looking for. It's an exciting time for Scottish food, and we are just here for the ride.
So anyone that wants to watch back any of the talks, will there be somewhere that they can do that?
Absolutely. We don't know where yet, but if you've got Instagram, follow Tenement Kitchen and Lindsey Middleton. All the information will be put on our stories and probably on the grid as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for coming.
And also some really good tea. It was good tea.
Excellent. Love that.
And cakes. Thanks to my guests for being on this episode, and thanks to you too for listening, hopefully over a good cup of tea. Please remember to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss an episode of Scran. Scran is co-produced and hosted by me, Rosalind, and co-produced, edited and mixed by Kelly Crichton. The Scran Awards are back for 2025, and we're looking for you to get involved by nominating your favourite chef, restaurant, pub or whisky. For more information and to nominate, as well as buy tickets, please visit www.scranawards.co.uk.